Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is bald eagles, a conservation success story, and it will be presented by our fabulous Nat Hab expedition leader, Eleanor Edye. Eleanor, thanks so much for being here today. I look forward to hearing all about the bald eagle success story. Let's dive in.
Thanks, Sunny, and hi to everybody joining us right now. Um, as Sunny said, my name's Eleanor, and I'm one of our Canadian-based expedition leaders here at Natural Habitat Adventures. And I'm excited to be here today talking with you about bald eagles. Um, as regards to why I wanted to talk about bald eagles, couple of reasons. Firstly, if you've followed any of my webinars in the past, my last two webinars have been on mass extinctions, and sometimes it's nice to talk about things where, species survive instead of everything dying. Um, but also because I am where I live in southern Canada right now is just kind of in the middle of our spring migration. And this year has been pretty phenomenal in my neck of the woods anyway, in terms of bald eagle sightings, to the point where even folks who don't pay any attention to birds whatsoever are saying things like, "What's up with all these eagles?" So while I know the story of the bald eagle kind of population crash and recovery is known to a lot of people, it's not known to everybody, and the current kind of conservation concerns might not be known to all as well. So it's just me taking an hour to talk about bald eagles and how cool they are, and also what kind of challenges they've been up against in the last couple of centuries. So, who doesn't love a conservation success story? Um, Done a couple of webinars on these animals that have come back kind of from the brink, almost to the point where you start going, why are there so many of them? I thought that these sightings were special, and now I can't turn around without seeing one. The American beaver is certainly another one like that, and we're looking at a similar situation for the bald eagle. Quick little shout out in terms of its place in kind of cultural history as well. As you are also probably aware, it's a national symbol of the United States of America beginning in 1782. And it's always been traditionally considered, a sign of strength. The Roman legions also use the bald, like not the bald eagle, because the bald eagles aren't found in Europe, but used eagles as their standard. Um, so it's always been kind of a symbol of strength and freedom and also of nature in many ways as well. So it's quite an iconic animal. So let's talk about it and what makes it so special to start off with. So the bald eagle has a name that I will probably butcher because I always struggle with this particular genus name, Haliaetus leucocephalus. Haliaetus means sea eagle, and leucocephalus meaning white-headed. So we call them the bald eagles, of course. The name bald eagle probably stems from an Old English usage of the word bald, which simply meant white-headed, not devoid of hair or feathers. So we scientifically, they are the white-headed eagles. They are big, big, beautiful birds. Um, the body length of a typical bald eagle ranges from about 28 to 40 inches. There is a big size difference in some populations of eagles, which we'll talk about right away. And the wingspan typically ranges from almost 6 feet to about 7.5 feet. And if you've ever looked at them and thought that they were pretty massive birds, I've been lucky enough to usually accidentally end up right beside eagles. I've never gone in intending to flush eagles, but sometimes you find yourself in a situation where there's you and there's an eagle, and they are big, big birds, um, reaching a top weight in some populations of almost 14 pounds. The bigger of the animals of the bald eagles are the females, which are about 25% larger, both in terms of their wingspan, length, as well as mass, than the males, with an average mass across all populations of bald eagles of about 12 pounds whereas the male's average weight is more around 9 pounds. Because I always like to kind of take apart our own assumptions about what things are, um, what is an eagle? An eagle isn't necessarily a closely related group of birds. Many eagles are related. They all belong to the same family, the Accitripidae. Um, but eagles belong to different genera, so different genus groupings, some of which are closely related, some of which aren't. So they're not actually a real natural group, but when we talk about a bird being an eagle, we are talking about the common usage where we're talking about any kind of a bird of prey that's large enough to hunt very sizable animals. And specifically for eagles, something around 18 inches or longer in size, specifically than a vertebrate. So they're taking fish, they're taking mammals, and other things that we'll talk about. Um, Bald eagles are very powerful flyers, so you often see them in the air soaring on thermal convection currents, and they can reach a top speed of about 40 to 45 miles per hour when they are gliding and flapping in those currents. A little bit slower if they're carrying prey, but their dive speed is quite fast, going up to about almost 100 miles per hour. It's usually not a vertical dive on the way down, it's like a horizontal attacking glide. Um, so they are very maneuverable in flight. They're strong flyers, they're fast flyers, they are fast divers, and they are also able to, as we'll talk about in a second as well, attack other birds in flight too. They are remarkably long-lived birds. In captivity, they have been recorded being up to 50 years old, and the oldest bird that we've known of in the wild reached the age of 38, which is a very respectable age for a big bird. In terms of where they're found, they are distributed solely within North America. So they are a North American bird. The colors that you can see here on this map of North America, the purple represents the year-round distribution of the bald eagle. The orange is the breeding ground, where they're like just seasonal breeding ground. There's certainly breeders like in that purple region as well. And blue is considered to be the non-breeding region. So that would simply be overwintering animals in those blue areas there. So as you can see looking at it, it is a bird with a very big range. It covers most of North America, most of Canada. Bald eagles are found in every state in the continental US, as well as large populations in Alaska, and they're simply missing from Hawaii if we're talking about US states. They have occasionally turned up other places as well. If you look at these little red blips on the map, these are what we call accidental records. So every so often a bird will show up, usually blown by storms or very strong air currents. And so there's been a couple of sightings of specifically juvenile bald eagles in Ireland throughout the years, a number of accidental sightings through Mexico. These are sometimes adult birds, but they are more often juvenile birds who are found kind of off course. And I like to kind of picture them as being very confused and upset birds when they end up somewhere that they're not supposed to be. Within this region here, where we're talking about, there are a lot of bald eagles now in a lot of different areas. In Canada, though, we found most of our bald eagles along the coast of British Columbia, so along the western coast, and certainly as you go down into the US as well, following along that western coastline, there are tremendous populations of bald eagles, and then up into Alaska. So the West Coast is a very prominent place to find these birds, as is the East Coast as well, simply not as full of birds as it is on the West Coast. We do recognize two subspecies of bald eagles, the northern bald eagle and the southern bald eagle. These subspecies are only differentiated by size and wing length, with the big birds being up north, especially in Alaska, And then the smaller birds being further south, especially in Florida, where you can have about a 25% size difference between the northern subspecies and the southern subspecies. Now, as we'll talk about in a little while, as we get into like conservation concerns and genetics of these populations, there's likely, like, whether or not these are true subspecies is always up for question because you can't really tell them apart in any way other than size. They certainly have the capacity to interbreed. There are genetic differences between at least 4 separate populations of eagles and possibly 5. Um, so you can tell looking at these images here, you could not tell these birds apart if you came across them out of context of where you were. It's very difficult to size a bird when it's just in the air or perched like that. Um, as I mentioned earlier, we would consider the bald eagle to certainly be related to other species of eagle within, uh, within that large bird of prey family. The genus Haliaeetus includes at least 4 species. So the bald eagle, the Steller's sea eagle, Pallas's fish eagle, and the white-tailed eagle. And depending which taxonomic revisions you follow, there may be some other species in there as well. It's always, as somebody who lives in the taxonomic world, there's always debates about what belongs with anything else. But within the family overall, there are 10 living species. This genus, Haliaeetus, is possibly, again, always up for debate, possibly one of the oldest like extant genera of living birds, so most long-lived groupings of birds. We have some paleontological evidence going back about 33 million years ago that appears to fit the same type of life form and same type of morphology as the birds that we see today in this same grouping. We think that the sea eagles overall originated around the Bay of Bengal during that period of time, around 30 million years ago, and they have diversified and spread out from there. They're pretty neat animals and overall tend to be quite large. When we talk about the bald eagle, we can certainly talk about it by itself, but we also often think about it in the context of the larger global population of eagles, because the bald eagle is very closely related to this other species in particular. This bird is called the white-tailed eagle, and it forms what is known as a species pair with the bald eagle. So the white-tailed eagle is found throughout Eurasia. It's gone through its own conservation challenges. It is still being reintroduced to some areas and is coming up in numbers as well. But it is found only where bald eagles are not, and bald eagles are only found where white-tailed eagles are not, so they don't co-occur in any locations except accidentally. And their life history is nearly identical. They feed on the same kind of thing. They nest in the same kind of habitat. You could, aside from the fact that one has a white head and one does not, you could easily confuse the two of them. And they work within that same ecological niche. We think that they likely diverged around 10 million years ago, but it might have been much more recently than that. And they've been separate ever since. So when we're talking about eagles, there are kind of sea eagles and fish eagles, and how do we kind of separate those things out? Well, as we already mentioned, humans like to draw boxes around things that shouldn't necessarily have boxes around them or might not be drawn around the most closely related species. So there are other eagles similar to this around the world. These are some other just cool ones I wanted to show, like the white-bellied sea eagle. Same family, different subfamily. They've got some differences in how they hunt. They tend to be a little bit smaller. they are closely related. And when I was saying that depending how you draw the box, they might include these species or they might not within the same genus. So we're probably always going to have that somewhat up for debate because it always is going to depend on who is writing the key to differentiate how we pull these species apart. So remember the range map that we looked at for where the bald eagle can be found. It's everything from, the very southernmost reaches of Florida up to and including all of those coastal lines around of Alaska. So we're talking about a bird who lives through a great diversity of habitats, a great diversity of environments, as well as a great diversity of environmental conditions. So with that, we know that they can live in lots of different conditions, lots of different situations, take lots of different prey species. But what is always in common for our bald eagles is that they are going to be found near the water, especially for those birds who might overwinter in areas that don't have like liquid water. They will still have access to water during those summer months at a bare minimum, or move themselves to be closer to water during the winter. So they are found in everything from northern tundra with no trees at all, down to the bayous of Louisiana and everything in between. Coasts of seas, rivers, lakes, marshes, really anywhere that you have an abundance of fish. We have a lot of research on bald eagles, and studies have shown that they show preferences for bodies of water where the circumference is greater than 7 miles. So they like bigger parts, or bigger lakes and things like that, but they will take smaller access to smaller lakes if there are fish found within those lakes. As mentioned, when they overwinter in areas where open water may not be easily available, they tend to congregate in areas with lots of big trees and lots of perching locations and lots of prey. For example, one of the big areas where bald eagles are known to congregate is around a city called Squamish in British Columbia, where they regularly have congregations of up to 2,000 bald eagles in a very small spot. They do consume quite the variety of prey. Most like vertebrate prey is what we're talking about here. They're not really insect eaters except accidentally. They will always prefer fish, but there is variety in what happens outside of that, and also especially in where in the species range we're looking at. So if we look at all bald eagles across their whole range, fish comprises about 56% of their diets. Other birds, about 28% of their diet, mammals, 14%, and other prey, about 2%. And that other prey is mostly going to be in southern areas where they're taking things like lizards for food. They are a very, very gregarious species in what they choose to eat. So there are over 400 species known to be prey species to the bald eagle. So when they are hunting fish, they will swoop down over the water and snatch fish out of the water with their talons. But that's not the only way that they get prey. I at least always had this image of bald eagles as, this majestic hunter. But they actually do a lot of what's called kleptoparasitism as well. So they will go after other birds, for example, osprey, and try to steal their food. They may also go after other birds like osprey or geese or hawks in the air and take them as prey species on the wing. Pretty neat things. This sequence here that we're just following here is it was a bird watcher in California who watched this bald eagle going after an osprey for about 10 minutes, trying to get this osprey to drop its salmon. And it was eventually successful. And you can see this bald eagle just going in on this very attacking dive towards this osprey a couple 100 feet up in the air. So we know that bald eagles will engage in that kleptoparasitism. They will go after carrion as well. In areas where there are other fish-eating birds like osprey or scavengers like coyotes, or foxes. The bald eagles are really, really effective at displacing other animals from their prey species. So they will, you know, I think sometime, if any of you have kids or grandkids, if you've had to sit through reading these, like, what would win? Shark versus crocodile books. I have a lot of hours of that behind me. What would win? Bald eagle versus anything? Bald eagle almost always comes out on top when it engaged with anything else that's trying to get at its at its food. Interestingly, the only evidence that we ever have of a bald eagle being not predated upon, but killed within the wild by another species was actually a common loon that was able to puncture just with its beak, I guess something critical on the bald eagle and kill the bald eagle when that eagle was trying to parasitize the nest of the loon. So that's kind of cool. So they will go, obviously we know them as fish hunters. They prefer eating fish. They will always go to areas with fish. They'll take it from other birds. They'll take it from the water, but it's not the only thing that they're going to eat. As we just mentioned, the next kind of thing down their priority list will be eating other birds. This here is a bald eagle about to pick off a common murre from a bird colony in Oregon. So they are very good at hunting things like gulls, murres, other seabirds, other water birds as well, for example, ducks. Um, so they will swoop in and take these quite easily, especially in those nesting colonies like that. Um, Preying on mammals, some mammalian prey is like number 3 on the list. It's much less frequently taken than fish or than other birds or avian prey. But there are areas, especially in like the central parts of North America, where overwintering birds don't have access to running water or liquid water to hunt fish, or a lot of, bird population to hunt from. So they may become predators of like medium or small sized mammals like prairie dogs or rabbits. Um, However, they like even rats and squirrels can be taken by bald eagles as well. Scavenging, especially of mammal carcasses, especially along roadways, is a real key factor in migration, especially in areas with frozen water or no appropriate fish habitat as well. Um, in one instance, a bald eagle was observed carrying a small, like a 15-pound mule deer fawn, and it was able to carry that amount of load. So these kind of access to foods, whether they are hunting their own mammals or they are simply scavenging off carcasses, is a key factor in these areas where there isn't that characteristic fishing habitat that they look for everywhere else. And when I see bald eagles during the migration in southern Manitoba, this is how I tend to see them. Um, I just last week accidentally flushed about 12 of them off a carcass on the side of the road because they were heading up north and they, I guess, found an open food source that looked pretty good. They sexually mature around at least 4 or about 5 years of age. It's thought that mostly when they're old enough to breed, they tend to return to the area where they're born, and it's generally the male who selects the habitat. Males tend to stay very close to where they hatched. Females have a larger dispersal area. Um, we know bald eagles as birds who tend to mate for life, but if one half of the pair doesn't make it, they will take a new mate. If they have been a pair that has repeatedly failed in breeding attempts, they may also break up at that point and start to look for more options. In terms of where they nest, we looked at that habitat. So they nest all through North America. In some areas, they tend to prefer to nest in coniferous trees, especially pines. They like old growth forests because to be a suitable nesting site, they need to be close to water, and they prefer to be up high wherever they can be. So that's things like those taller old growth trees, but it can also be cliffs, rock pinnacles. On very, very few occasions, they've been recorded nesting on human-made structures, but generally it's bigger trees with ready access to water, um, as well as those coniferous trees preferentially are hardwood trees if they don't have access to conifers. Okay, so here's a bald eagle pair building their nest. As we can see, there's no real like plumage difference between the male and female. They both look the same once they're sexually mature, just that the female's bigger than the male. Um, so they're looking for those big trees with proximity to prey, and bald eagle nests are just enormous. If you've ever seen one, like they're big birds and they need a big nest. The biggest recorded nest ever found was in Florida. It was in 1963 and it was almost 10 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The depth of the nest sometimes has to do with how long the nest has been there, because they will sometimes reuse that same nest and simply put more nesting material on top in following years. Something that's really important during that nesting season is that bald eagles are quite sensitive to human activity during the nesting time, and they are very well known for picking sites well away from where humans might disturb them. So they like to prefer, or they do prefer those more remote areas without a lot of humans tromping by. It doesn't mean we can't watch them. I just wanted to throw this in there because this is something I like to do. You can watch bald eagle nests online. I was doing this just last week. You can go on to explore.org. They have a number of different streams of bald eagle nests, and you can watch them hatch and grow and fledge as they go through this process. So you can see them adding new materials to that structure. Over that time, they'll create a small depression with softer vegetation in the middle, as well as feathers, and that is where the female is going to lay 1 to 3 eggs, most often 2, a couple of days apart in that depression. They will incubate for about 35 days. There's always one of the adults on the nest at that time, and then the hatching will happen at that same interval. So whatever egg is laid first will hatch first, and then if there's a second or third egg that was laid, they will hatch, 2 to 4 days apart as well. So you get a size difference between the chicks. This is from that same camera with 2 chicks from this nest. So they're covered in this gray down at hatch time, and they will start to sprout feathers around 4 to 5 weeks old. They will start to fly at around that 10 or 11 week period. Females, because they're a little bit bigger, usually need a few extra days to get to the point of flight. Something that I think is really cool is to think about lifetime reproductive success. So how often will a pair of eagles, we mostly count just from the female because we can track females more readily than a pair, how many birds will grow up to survive from a single female? So there's been a couple of studies. One which I was reading recently was set in Northern California, where they tracked 19 individuals over a 20-year period, and those 19 individual birds produced anything from 0 to 36 babies. But of those 19 birds that were tracked, 2 of the adult birds produced a full third of the young that survived, and 5 of the birds put together produced over half of the young. So there's actually a really big difference in individual rates of success for these birds. There are birds who may never have a nest success, who may never go on to have a fledgling. And there are birds who will consistently produce and produce and produce successful nests. There's a wide variety of survivorship estimates when we go on to track fledgling birds through their first and second years. At the high end estimates, you might see numbers up around 30% loss in that first year. And just look at that. Just look at that baby on the right side there. That is one who's just starting to get its pin feathers. It is not a good looking bird. Birds just look so funny at this stage. Okay, so some studies up to 30% loss in the first year, but other studies reported numbers much closer to zero. In a lot of cases, like if they're able to fledge, they have a very good chance of survival through their first year and then through subsequent years as well. We'll talk about mortality causes in birds, but the summation of that is that most birds die from human impact still to this day. We'll talk in a bit about why that is and where it comes in. So there are a lot of species out there. Picking one just to kind of throw it out there as an example, the blue whale would be a great example of this, where when we're talking about conservation challenges, we don't necessarily talk about what's happening right now. We talk about all the things that happened in the past because populations are now, they might be low from not what we're doing right now, but what has happened in the past and has already been resolved. The bald eagles have gone one step beyond this, and we're going to talk about what we did to them that was not so great and how they have recovered from that. So if we take a big step back in time and talk about our time of first European contact in North America, or first kind of recorded European contact time, we have estimates of probably 500,000 bald eagles in North America, just based on incidence records that we have from the time. So bald eagles, very, very, very common raptor before European colonialism got its foot in North America. As the colonial influence expanded across North America, we started to see the decline in bald eagle numbers starting for sure in the late 1800s, and especially in the USA, because in the US you had a lot of settling happening across the whole region, whereas in Canada, we didn't have as much impact through European contact going, across the entirety of our country. So the first decline in the population was because of, European settlers moving westwards, cutting those old growth forests down, plowing the prairies and removing prairie dog populations, competing directly with the eagles for fish, and purposefully as well as accidentally killing birds. We know that in the first half of the 1900s, that over 100,000 bald eagles were killed just in Alaska. And we know that because we actually paid bounties on those eagles, because there was concern that bald eagles were competing with fishermen for access to fish like salmon. So we see stories like this all around the world, as populations start to decline of your target species like salmon, people say, well, it can't be us. It's not us causing this decline. It's got to be the eagles. We have to remove the eagles. So we saw big, big declines just by humans purposely trying to remove bald eagles from the equation, similar to what we've done with coyotes and wolves, similar to what we've done with some of the species of whales out there that can compete in theory with us for fish. But that wasn't necessarily the most damaging thing that we ever did to bald eagles. Many of you are probably very aware of this history that we have around DDT, and I'm probably going to butcher this name as well, diphenyl trichloroethane. Wasn't so bad. So it was a chemical compound. It's an organochloride developed for use as an insecticide, and started commercial use around 1940. It was used throughout the second half of the World War II to limit spread of insect-borne diseases like malaria and typhus. And then starting in 1945 was available for public sale in the US. It was also used in Canada and other areas throughout the world for about a 25 to 30-year period. It was used heavily during this time, and then we stopped use of it entirely after that point. And I'm betting that many people know this story of why we had to stop it, but also how prevalent it was at the time. It was, it's not something that impacted humans at all. We know from toxicity studies it was actually very safe for humans, but very toxic to insects. The other thing that it did is within the metabolism of organisms like insects, like smaller fish that consume DDT, it went through a chemical change to another form called DDE that was stable in the tissues of those animals. So as smaller fish were eaten by bigger fish, and those fish were eaten by bigger fish again, the DDE stayed within that food chain and began to do what is called bioaccumulate, meaning that because an animal like an osprey that was eating big fish that had eaten medium fish that had eaten lots of small fish had therefore gotten a very big load of DDE into their systems through that bioaccumulation. So for a long time, DDT was one of the most widely used pesticides in the world, and it probably directly contributed to the death of some eagles through removing some of their prey species and being toxic to fish as well. But the biggest thing that happened was that it prevented reproduction. The majority of eggs that were laid by bald eagles throughout the like late 1940s, 1950s, and 60s had these extremely fragile shells that when the eagles would sit on the nest to incubate, they would actually squish the shells of the eggs. They were at least 33% thinner, and that was thin enough to just be so soft that the weight of an eagle would squish their own eggs. It became quite scary very quickly when eagle counts were happening kind of in the late 50s, early 60s, when researchers realized that nobody had seen any juveniles that year. Bald eagles go through a successional plumage changes so that you can roughly identify how old an eagle is by its plumage. And there were no juveniles that had been seen because no babies had been born. As we talked about nest success earlier, the nest success during the times that DDT was being used, instead of being 1 to 2 eagles per, eagle fledglings per nest, would have been something more like 0.2 young produced per nest. So not zero, but very, very low. And by the mid 1950s, there were only 412 nesting pairs that were able to be found. So think about that, right? So down from an estimated pre-contact population of 500,000 down to 412 nesting pairs within the US. That was an incredibly steep decline. And once you are no longer recruiting young, that population can decline pretty steeply because the other causes of mortality don't stop in the adults as well. It's not like they stop dying just because they're not having any young. What happened was actually a very quick change in on the political side of things. Things change very quickly. And we did have a large amount of legislation that was put in place for eagle protection. You might be aware of the Migratory Bird Treaty of 1918. Eagles were not generally considered part of that. But in 1940, we did set out to protect in the US eagles. This was later renamed as the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act to prevent people from taking, possessing, selling, purchasing, bartering, offering to sell, transport, export, or import anything from any bald eagle, alive or dead, any parts. So high levels of protection there. And then in 1967, they were declared an endangered species in the US. This declaration of it being listed as an endangered species really allowed for more legislation to be able to step in. And in 1972, DDT was banned from usage in the USA, and it was officially banned in Canada in 1989, though it had been pretty well effectively dropped to zero before that point. The species recovery, once we stopped, preventing them from breeding, was relatively swift. So we saw kind of a typical logarithmic curve. So we had very small numbers of eagles, but once they could start reproducing, then we had more eagles, and then more eagles to reproduce, and then more eagles to reproduce. And we have now gotten to a point where we have not quite full species recovery, but a pretty amazing state. So the bald eagle was downgraded from endangered to threatened in 1995 in the US, and it was fully delisted in 2007. Through the Christmas bird count, we now have a population estimate in the US of 316,708 bald eagles, which is this is still mind-blowing to me. And if I'm just going to go back for a second, we've seen relatively high numbers of eagles for some time now, but because we're looking at that logarithmic growth and recovery, you go from having, no bald eagles to maybe you see a few bald eagles, and then all of a sudden it's like you're swarmed by bald eagles. And for a lot of people, it's just been in the last year or two, or maybe 5, where it suddenly felt that everywhere that you look, there are eagles again. So it's really been an incredible rebounding in Canada. Similar things have happened. So if we think about the US having over 300,000 eagles, the Canadian numbers will be not quite as high, but also doing very well. What has been one of the coolest things about this, I think, is that because we've done genetic testing on all these birds and through some more managed recovery of replacing populations by moving juvenile birds around, one of the questions that we had through this recovery is when you shrink a population that much, you tend to go through what's called a bottleneck, right? So you're left with only the genes that were found in that very, very small population. And as you recover, have you lost the diversity that was present in that original population? And the genetic studies that have been done have shown us that there are still surprisingly high levels of genetic diversity, but also genetic structure. So we can still pinpoint by genetics which birds come from the northern habitats, which birds come from the Arizona region, which birds come from the Midwest or the Eastern region. So we may not have the same level of genetic variability that we had, back in the 1800s, but it's pretty amazing how much has been retained through this recovery. And this is not my picture. I have been without my camera every single time I've come across a big group of birds, but this is now what we're seeing during migration, right? From this low of 400 and some nesting pairs to, you go out and you look out your window and your tree's full of bald eagles because they are on their migratory route. It's just a completely amazing change. Just as an example, this is my home province of Manitoba. We call ourselves the land of 100,000 lakes because we are just covered in water. There are lots of places around the world that you can, not around the world, around North America that you can see bald eagles. Every time you're going to see them, it's still special, right? Even if you're starting to see them all over the place. But if you wanted to go out and see them, some of your best areas is always going to be around water, especially larger bodies of water. In Manitoba, these are confirmed nesting sites that we have. This arrow pointing here is pointing towards the community of Churchill, where we run polar bear trips. And you're not going to see bald eagles in polar bear season, but if you come up to see beluga whales in the summer, the place is just lousy with eagles these days because they are migrating there in the summer. They are breeding there. We have a number of established breeding pairs who come up every summer, and every time I look up, I just see juvenile bald eagles all around. It's been even just a change in the years that I have been traveling to these locations, an incredible increase in the number of birds. Now, I don't want to leave us with leaving us with good news is always great. I don't want us to get lackadaisical though, because humans are still the biggest threat that bald eagles face. Whether it's directly interacting with bald eagles by trapping or poisoning them or shooting them, or indirectly, um, just encroaching on their habitat or putting power lines through, humans are still the greatest cause of mortality that bald eagles see. Um, you'd think it would be, old age or starvation or something like that, but we estimate that at least 70% of bald eagle deaths are human caused, either directly or indirectly, and it's probably higher than that because even when bald eagles die from starvation or sickness, it may still be because, humans have encroached on habitat or have introduced new pest species, for example. Electrocution on power lines has been a significant cause of big bird death over a very long time. In one study, an estimate of over 11 million birds per year within the US. So this is not just bald eagles, but it is primarily bigger birds, and bald and golden eagles are certainly hit by this as well. Wind farms, unfortunately, are also a major cause of bird death. I'm not saying that wind farms are overall bad, but they do cause mortality, especially to our bigger raptors. Um, right now in the US, there are permits to wind farms allowing, um, deaths of up to 4,200 bald eagles per year without penalty, and those permits will last 30 years. So we are expecting, as a number of wind farms grows, that we're going to see impacts is a terrible word in this case, but we're going to see impacts on the bald eagle population in those areas, especially because wind farms are often where there's a lot of wind, and that wind tends to be near open areas. Sometimes that's in the plains, but often it's also beside water where bald eagles want to be. Um, a study published in 2022 found that more than half of adult eagles across the majority of the US states have suffered from lead poisoning. The primary cause is when they are scavenging carcasses of animals shot by hunters. Um, you may be surprised, depending on whether you are a hunter or a harvester yourself, about how much lead shot there is still being used. There have been bans on the use of lead shot for shooting water birds because of the thought that that would then positively impact eagle populations, so they're not interacting with the lead that way. But because they're still used in shots for mammal hunting, it is still something that affects bald eagles, and that amount of shot being held in that person's hand represents a lethal dose to a bald eagle. And that's still the most common ammunition type in the US. Um, habitat disturbance is a big factor as well. Humans have a pretty big footprint, right? It's everything from vehicle strikes as our highways wind through their habitats, and we hit other animals that then bald eagles want to scavenge. But even like just the mere presence of a human being in a bald eagle territory can be impactful to them. So we know that disturbance of humans on bald eagles, increase if you spend more time around them, and increase when they're disturbed more often. And one of the things that actually disturbs them most is a human on foot. So even just like if you're hiking through an area that happens to have bald eagle nesting, in areas where nests are known to be, there may be exclusion zones set up, and we often don't even share the location of nests because we know that if people get too close, even just on foot, that's one of the worst things for stressing out those birds when they're nesting. Now, it's not all bad news. Bald eagles are actually starting to show a generational habituation to spending more time around people. We might call this good news, bad news situation, but the fact of the matter is humans are all over and we're not going anywhere. So if bald eagles become more tolerant of living around us and we're not directly harassing them, um, if they're able to nest and exist in areas with high levels of human impact, that may be something that works out really well for them. This spring, this March, we have a documented nesting pair in the greater Toronto area. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Toronto or flown over Toronto. It is it is people. It is a very dense, very big city that has never ever had a nesting pair of bald eagles, as far as we know. And this year it does. Nobody's saying where the nest is found, and that's great because we don't want people going in and harassing them. But the fact that we have a set of birds who perhaps, grew up around some level of human activity and now feel potentially comfortable raising their own offspring in areas where humans can be found is, probably good news for the long-term implications of bald eagle populations in North America. So I don't know where the migration is at where you are, but I highly encourage you to get out there and look at some birds. And if you were lucky enough to see a bald eagle or a whole host of bald eagles, that is wonderful, and I very much wish that for you all. I will hand things back to Sunny for any questions.
Eleanor, thank you so much. You are so good at connecting the dots for me. I learned so much and like just walk away with such a better framework for understanding um, Eagles today, but all the topics that you discussed. So thank you again for being such a good teacher. We've got a ton of questions, so we're going to dive right in. Um, let's see. Are there non-human predators for bald eagles?
Oh, that's a good question. And you know what? It's it's almost a struggle to call ourselves predators because we're not going out there and taking birds for the purpose of, eating them and putting them on our Thanksgiving table. That would be a different meal. We have always gone out and removed bald eagles because we've seen them as competition for prey species. The only the only known natural killer of a bald eagle is the single instance of a common loon that managed to stab an eagle through its throat. So I don't know if any of you have seen a common loon. They've got very pointy beaks and they're very fast in the water. And I guess eagles should really stay away from messing with them. But that loon didn't turn around and eat the eagle. It was just kind of an incidental killing as it was trying to protect its young.
Got it. Okay. Um, do you know if the bald eagles that end up in Ireland ever make their way back to North America?
I don't believe that they did so. These occasions were a number of years back, like back in the 60s and 70s. One bird was kind of never seen again, if memory serves, and one bird was quote unquote accidentally killed because it was mistaken as something else. So that bird definitely did not make its way back. Poor thing.
Hmm. What determines the size of a bald eagle territory? Does the size of a territory depend on food availability, or what are the different factors there?
Yeah, the territory size will certainly vary based on where you are. So the smallest territory that we know of is in some of the really good bald eagle habitat, like along coastal Alaska. And this, when we talk about bald eagle habitat and their territory, we usually judge it based on like at what point they start exhibiting territorial behaviors away from their nests. So like they will try to protect their territory and their nesting habitat from other eagles. And as an aside, we actually think that one of the reasons for juvenile plumages compared to adult plumages is because these are very aggressive behaviors and they will not show that same level of aggression towards a juvenile bald eagle who's not trying to nest and is just trying to like eat. But if it is another adult bald eagle, they will show these aggressive behaviors and territorial defense. So in that very prime habitat of coastal Alaska, the diameter, not the diameter, the radius, so the distance from their nest that they will defend is about half a kilometer. So, a third of a mile. And that is what we think to be the minimum territorial size of a bald eagle. It certainly goes up from there. We've seen like 2 kilometer, 5 kilometer radiuses, but if they're nesting somewhere, they have to be close enough to the nest that they can effectively, carry prey back. So that 5 kilometer radius is already that's a really, really big territory for a bald eagle. And we're not likely to see anything bigger than that. Because if it has to be bigger than that to get food, it's not a good nesting habitat. They're not going to want to be there.
Mm,
Outside of nesting season, when they're in those bigger congregations and sharing perches, they don't have any territorial defense. We're only talking about territories in regards to defending their nesting habitat.
okay. Do bald eagles seem to get along with each other during migration?
Oh yeah, during migration they definitely do. It's really cool to see, and I wish I had more time to spend watching them, because you will see them they will flock together, they will fly as a group. They will perch together, and these will be mixed age classes. So you'll see adults, you'll see juveniles, all migrating together, and they will often also share the same food sources. So you might see a big congregation of them, like I did last week, around a deer carcass at the side of the road, for example. So there's certainly they're they're not, I would say, the kindest birds, right? They're still kind of snappy. If you see one get into each other's face, they'll kind of snap at them to get back. But they're definitely, if not cooperative, at least very tolerant of each other during migration.
Mm. Where do young eagles go when they leave home? Do they stay close by, or is there competition with the parent?
Yeah, so those juveniles, when they fledge, they will. Okay, it depends if you are in a migratory population or in a population that stays always within the same area. So say you are a bald eagle who was hatched in Florida, you expect to always stay in Florida, no reason to leave Florida, it's pretty great. If you're a male, you will likely disperse by the time you are an adult, so 4 to 5 years old, you will be somewhere fairly close to where you hatched, but you will be setting yourself up to defend your own territory in that same general area. Females seem to disperse further, so they will look to find a mate further away from home. And this is a nice way of, making sure that we have more gene flow around the population. Whether or not they thought of this themselves, I don't know. But we usually see dispersal of one sex and not both. And that way you know that the females coming into your area are not likely to be closely related to you, and they're a good potential mate. The same thing happens in birds in a migratory group. Um, so when they come back, say there's a couple of bald eagles, I assume it's the same pair I've been watching in Churchill for a long time because they come back to the same nest. Those two bald eagles will keep coming back to their nest. At this point, the juveniles who are also there, many of those juveniles are likely also related to those initial parent birds. And as they mature themselves, the males will likely establish a territory close by to where they hatched again, and females will likely disperse in from further populations. So in short, the males stay close to where they grew up, the females will go further away, and it just gets a little more complicated if they're migratory.
Mm. Well, that is the last question we have time for today. So I will hand it back to you for closing comments.
Oh, well, thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day to talk about bald eagles. I hope you get some good sightings this year, and I hope you get to see these congregations of eagles are really, really neat, and I hope that you make your way to seeing one someday. Um, I hope everybody also has a great day, and I will see you at a future webinar. Thanks so much, Sunny.
Thanks again, Eleanor. You are truly an encyclopedia of knowledge. So thanks again for sharing it with us. I also want to thank everybody who submitted questions. You guys submit such intelligent, thought-provoking questions, and I'm sorry we don't always get to answer all of them, but please do keep sharing your curiosity with us. Thank you for tuning in. You can join us next week, or sorry, tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. I've got my whole day and week mixed up. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.